There you go. Right, recording in progress. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second session of our fall seminar on Russian literature history. And it is my very great pleasure tonight to welcome Dr. Erika Camisa. Erika is a lecturer of Slavic languages and literature at Stanford University. Erika completed her BA and her MA at the University of Pavia in Italy. Additionally, she studied in Warsaw and conducted research in Leipzig. She received her PhD in Slavic languages and literatures and held a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Southern California. Her current research project explores the origins of lyric poetry and the emergence of the notion of individuality in East Slavic space in the 17th and 18th centuries. In conducting this research, she focuses in particular on writers such as Simeon Politsky, Kirill Istomin, Pyotr Buslaev, Teofan Prokopovich, and Andrei Belobotsky. She also works on the contribution of female poets to the establishment of a lyric tradition, thanks to their bringing to light elements of individual inner life that were traditionally excluded from literature. In connection with this, she examines especially poems by the Moskvina sisters, Nielova, Dolgorukova, and Anna Bunina. The title of her talk today is New Spaces in Russophone Lyric, Everyday Life, Private Spaces, and Corporeality at the Turn of the 19th Century. Erika, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I would like to thank Rodolfo Boden for inviting me to present here today, and all of you for dedicating time to this presentation, which I hope will generate a lively discussion. As Rodolfo said, today I will focus on a later period than I would usually study. So I'm focusing on the turn of the 19th century. And specifically today I would like to focus on the contribution of female poetry by focusing on 2 instances. The first one is Deathbed or Smirny Odre by the Moskvina sisters, and May Walk of an Ill Woman or Mayska Прогулка Болящей by Anna Bunina. So some of you may wonder why these 2 poems, right? Well, because Russophone female poets develop a lyric voice that is characterized by unprecedented introspection and concreteness, defined by biographic details and physical sensations that were unusual for poetry at the time. These characteristics are taken up by later lyricists, so we can say that female authors have also contributed to establishing a lyric tradition in Russia, in the Russian Empire. Nevertheless, female poetry has long been excluded from most historical accounts of East Slavic and Russian lyrics. Several elements have contributed to this state of things. For instance, the reception, we might say critical reception by certain literary critics, such as Vissarion Bedinsky. However, we have research by scholars such as Amanda Ewington, Barbara Helt, Katriona Kelly, Maria Nesterenko, Wendy Roslin, and Ursula Stoller that has brought female poetry into a clearer view. So it is time to, I would say, include female authors in the canon and history of Russian poetry, as well as, I would say, also literary history and comparative studies more broadly, which is a work that I hope will continue in the future years. So let's now focus on the historical period, right? So we are in the second half of the 18th century when the first poem signed and authored by a woman is published. We are in 1759. The author is Ekaterina Knyazhnina, born Sumarokova, who published a poem on the journal of the Industry Zvi, Trudolюбивая пчела. And although some scholars maintain that this elegy was published under Knyazhnina's name, but was actually composed by her father, Alexander Sumarokov, this still remains the first known poem to this day that was published and signed by a Russian female poet. So The poem bears historical significance because it interrupts the long-standing habit of publishing female verses anonymously or under a male pseudonym. So how did we get to this point? At the beginning of the century, Peter I's demand that women exert, as he wrote, a civilizing influence through refined language and conversation fostered the inclusion of noble women into the public sphere and high culture society. Other 18th century reforms, such as, for instance, the opening of schools for young women, the establishment of private typographies, the increasing circulation of books, also granted women expanded access to literature. In the second half of the century, the proliferation of literary works written by European women, Enlightenment ideals, and sentimentalist poetics also jointly led to a reevaluation of the role of women in society, which were no longer seen as crucial only in the familiar, friendly, and sentimental circuits, but also as readers and authors of literature. Of course, also Catherine II's own activity as a writer further legitimized and supported female writing. So can we talk of gender equity in poetry? No. As Ewington, Stoller, and Rossley point out, female writers were confined mostly to the aristocratic milieu and limited to the middle styles of elegies, eclogues, bucolic, idyllic poems, as well as usually private themes, right? Sentiments, familiar-friendly bonds, didactic or devotional reflections. So this means that high themes and genres, such as tragedies and odes, but also the lower genres of comedies and satires were usually, so to say, off limits. Of course, there are notable exceptions. Let's think about Ekaterina Rusova, who composed both epics and tragedies like Polion and Heroide. And then after the 1790s, several poets, female poets like Maria Sushkova, Alexandra Natalia Magnitskaya, Alexandra Morzina, Maria Pospilova, Anna Bunina became acknowledged authors of solemn odes. But in general, we can say that neoclassical poets were seen as prophet, inspired by the divine, mediating between the divine and the reader. And however, it was not easy for female poets to claim such authority. So we can say that the work of these two female authors, the Moskvina sisters and Bunina, is framed within the shift from end of the century sentimentalism to 19th century poetry. Schönle has highlighted the moderacy of Russian sentimentalism, right, which remains subterraneously infatuated with the general, the universal, and the moral, because Orthodox culture is more centered on the exercise of rituals than on moral self-examination and dispassionate self-reflection. So in other words, we can say, so at the turn of the 19th century, however, a more, we can say, individualized self made their way through both female lyrics and male lyrics against the backdrop of a departure from normative or neoclassical poetics. So female poets benefiting from these changes gained poetic independence, taking advantage of the sentimental appreciation for female sensibility and of its consideration as a tool for refining and raising the moral standards of male behavior. Women also gained new spaces to lyric poetry that will become part then of the poetic tradition by expressing their personal feelings and ideas, by focusing on topics that were mostly unexplored, including personal stories, everyday life, corporeality. So today I will focus on these two poems. Okay, and these two poems, we have A Deathbed of Smrtny Odre, dated 1802 by the Moskvina sisters. And then we have May Walk of an Ill Woman or Mayska Прогулка Болящей, dated 1812 by Anna Bunina. These two poems introduce their contemporaneous readers to a new situation because it is the first time that sickness appears in Russian poetry, with the exception that I found is exception by Teofan Prokopowicz at the beginning of the century, who wrote these lines about fever. So death, which is the most frequent theme in early modern and Slavic poetry, appears here from a novel viewpoint. As Vladimir Yankelevich observes, I am always before my own death, right? The during or even the after are persistently precluded to me. Death during our entire life is in the future. The poems by the Moskvina sisters and by Bunina instead show as concretely as possible the terrible approaching of death, confirming that, as Roslin wrote, the poetic I is most strongly asserted when the self is threatened with disintegration. Moskvina and Bunina approach the experience during death through eyes who find their self-esteem compromised and who suffer from bodily destruction and despair. It is with poems like these that poetry moved away from abstract class imagery and edifying messages. So as a result, lyric voices do not show exemplary characteristics, but personal sorrow they wish to share with others. And so let's start from the title, right? So the clarity, immediacy, and specificity of the title of Moskvina's poem launches readers into the liminal period between the end of life and the moment of passing. This poem, which comprises 84 lines of iambic hexameter grouped into rhyming couplets with alternate female and male endings, is traditionally attributed to Maria Moskvina, although it is included in the collection of poems published in 1902, Aonia, published jointly by the two sisters Elizaveta and Maria. In its opening couplet, the lyric voice reveals her uniqueness and particularity. Уж полночь, 2 часа так косвенно пробила. На небе мрак, и все спокойно, тихо было. In this couplet, we do not have the typical 18th century panegyrist, right, who contemplates the physical, temporal, and metaphysical breadth of the empire. Here we have a lyricist who focuses on the confined space of a room where this ill woman is lying. In a similar way, we also don't have that light that is necessary to visualize the visual dominant identified by Marcus Levitt as characteristic of much 18th century Russian literature, but we have instead the darkness of the night. The lyric persona shares her viewpoint with us. So from her deathbed, she can keep track of the passage of time by listening to the tolling of the bell. So the night is shrouded in such darkness that she only perceives silence and calm. But as we read in the third line, this calm, this silence, does not come from being at peace, but instead it is a deadly calm. Казалось, мертвенность природа обреклась. So through paratactic sentences and verbal ellipses, the voice conveys a gradual detachment from life. And the consistency between the poem's stylistic and thematic levels enraptures the reader with a lyric voice that is defined by her sensorial experiences and her closeness to death. The voice is not here in the vertical position that we see in odes very often, right? And that is able to control space and time. Instead, here she is lying horizontally on the deathbed, which is a position of forced immobility. In this way, Moskvina introduces us to the bedroom, which is one of the most intimate spaces in the house, which is destined usually for personal use. So as Gaston Bachelard observes, the essence likes to retreat into its corner, especially when it feels threatened. And here in Moskvina's poem, with the introduction of the corner-like space of the bedroom, the self-entire life is entering lyric poetry. However, Moskvina's voice does not communicate in the low style of gesture, space, and behavior that is usually connected with a private, intimate space, she instead uses the dignified tone of a person who is aware that she's experiencing a very solemn moment. And by doing so, Moskvina opens up new spaces for poetry, as it is likely the first time that a bedroom and a deathbed feature in a Russophone lyric. So something similar was occurred about 77 years prior in painting. So at the beginning of the century, we have Ivan Nikitin, who portrayed the deceased Peter I on the deathbed upon his death in 1725. And the same goes also for the nighttime. As Gennady Vdovin points out, to the 18th century and its hero belongs the glory of the discovery of the night. It is he who justifies it and takes it away from the evil. Vdovin then continues by identifying in darkness a metaphor for the internal, as it occurs also in Moskvina's poem. So realism and the nighttime place Moskvina in line with the artistic trends of the time, trends that then paved the way for much 19th century art in general. So time also contributes to define the lyric speaker, who counts the hours and days, as well as experiences time in a way that is intense, but also slowed down, dilated. So on the one hand, Moskvina's eyes upends the motif of tempus fugit by showing that time dilates during death. Минута каждая казалась мне за час. On the other hand, the eye records the passing of time through her senses. Уж третья ночь, как я со смертью борюсь, пятый час. So time here symbolizes human impermanence. Минута, что к концу торопит ближе нас.
Erika, I'm sorry for interrupting. Are you showing us the right slide? Do you have any slides with the poem that you are discussing right now? Because we're still watching the Teofan Prokopovich one.
Oh, yes, I actually went on. Sorry.
Can you share the slide with us? I think it would be easier for us to follow. And
Yes.
really enjoy.
Okay. So let's see. So I was showing this one, which is, what do you see now?
I am always before my own death, and then Yankelevich, and then Wendy Roslin. That's line number 3.
Okay. Now, is it moving?
It's still the same.
Okay, wait, sorry. I'm going to retry.
Okay, yeah.
Now
we see the next one, but
okay. Sorry, I'm trying to understand.
No problem. If you want to send it to me, I can,
Yes.
Show the slides when you ask me to move from one to the next.
I'm gonna try the last time, and then if it doesn't work, I'll send it to you.
Okay.
Just So what slide are you seeing now?
Deathbed, Смертный одр, 84 lines of iambic.
Okay. And now is it moving?
Nope.
Oh, okay. I send it to you.
Appropriate. They wouldn't move considering the topic. Oh, now they're moving.
Oh, they are. Okay. I don't know. Probably it's better if I send it to you.
We see the pictures now.
You see the pictures?
Yep. Peter the
okay.
And nighttime. Much.
Yes. Okay. So maybe it moves better if I do like this.
There you go. Now it moves. Yeah, tempus fugit. Yep.
Okay. Okay, so well, when I was talking about the paintings, I was showing the two paintings I was referring to. And then I was talking now about the passing of time. And so the two ways in which time moves in the poems. On the one hand, we have this, so to say, dilated time here, where an instance I brought was the first instance, right? The first quote. Minuta каждая казалась мне за час. But on the other hand, it also happens that then the eye records the passing of time through her senses, and this is the second quote, where it says, «Уж третья ночь, как я со смертью борюсь», пятый час. And so then time symbolizes human impermanence. Минута, что к концу торопит ближе нас. So that's the last quote from the poem. And so as Bataille writes, in the same way as time, the self that dies is pure change. Because the passage of time is one and the same here in the poem with the progression of illness. So time and space are so closely interconnected that we may even devise a new chronotope, the chronotope of the deathbed. So if the slides are moving, you should now see like a slide with the chronotope. I just brought this quote just in case, not everyone is familiar with this concept. The word chronotope comes from two Greek words, chronos, which means time, and topos, which means space. And it was theorized at the beginning of the 20th century by Bakhtin. And basically the main idea of this concept is this intrinsic interconnectedness between space and time. And so since space and time are so interconnected also in Masquina's poem, it seems to me that we could think of of this chronotope. We could treat the deathbed as a chronotope. So in this chronotope, encounters and dialogues that are very rare. Space is restricted, time dilates until it stops indefinitely, sensorial perceptions are heightened, and actions are mostly the inner ones of the spirit, and the body is motionless. Here, the individual is alone, enjoying the sporadic company of a few close ones. Обдящие мне трудами отягченные лежат повержены природой усиленной, или преклонясь сидят у ложа моего. Смежил их очи сон, не внемлет ничего. So here, the distance between the ill woman and those who attend to her is introduced to the conjugation bat or a in Russian, and people like close to the persona, but they do not interact with her. Their actions are mostly passive, as they are burdened, they lie, sit, they are prostrate, they are lulled to sleep by nature, or sleep has closed their eyes. So their senses are softened by the burdens of the situation, unable to understand what the persona is experiencing. In fact, she shares with us all of her deepest feelings and thoughts, right? She tells us that tormented by illness, she's languishing in grief, but her acquaintances remain unaware of the richness of her inner life. So since the moribund sensorial experiences are spatially and temporally limited, each perception is heightened and charged with symbolic meaning. So the realistic detail of the fire's dim light becomes the only sign of life and even life in the darkness that evokes death. Similarly, the clock marks the passing of time, emphasizing our physical limitations. Одна, часы в руках, глядеть стараюсь их, но не могу. The eye's limitations are counterbalanced by her intensified perceptions. She has so deeply internalized the few quotidian objects that constitute her limited human experiences that the ticking of the clock seems to echo within my heart. Hearing is intensified because, as Duran says, the ear is the sense of the night. And so while the night is the moment that gives, and here there is a quote from Jeanette, gives the sense of intimate depth, of physical or psychic interiority. It is also a maternal symbol, a symbol of maternal place, of that maternal place, of that night of the bowels where everything starts. The feminine night is, in its abyssal depth, life and death together, right? It is the night that gifts us with the day, but also the night that will take it from us again. So in the chronotype of the deathbed, space, time, and loneliness are interwoven, communicating a deep inner experience in which the I develops self-perception and also near mystic experiences that are often connected with the night. The I in the deathbed by Moskvina only carries out one internal action, which is fighting against death. This ultimate action determines the heroism of the individual, who is alone in attempting this endeavor. Заснувших крепким сном я стоном разбудила, уведомить меня, который час спросила, сказали, 5 час, уж время бы послать, в страдании моем мне помощь искать. So the I conveys that illness is the name of her fight against death and that it causes her to moan and grieve. Thanks to illness, suffering is united to death in a deep way, and its horror emerges in every line. The voice shows her suffering physically, developing a personalized contemplation that echoes the changes not just in women's writing, but in Russian literature more generally, as poetry was moving toward more somber, tearful, intimate reflections on mortality. So in this circumstance, the I's consciousness expands over the surrounding space. Парил мой дух везде, и все мне представляю. So consistent with the intimate character of the composition, the I is addressing not the inhabitants of the empire, but if you selected one, in fact, the entire poem is addressing любезные друзья, dear friends, right? The voice seems to be anticipating death. Вообразил он смерть в ужасе моем, о сколь она страшна в событии своем. The terror in these lines is not the fear of death as a universal event, but rather dread for her own death, which is perceived as a real forthcoming event in the moment that she utters without these lines without hesitation. This trauma triggers the self-introspection by descending with thoughts into the depths of the heart. And so she says, с тех пор, как стала я себя лишь познавать, познала я, что мы родилась страдать. Но все ужасен час, коль живо шутить, что близок нам конец и скоро, может быть, должны дать ответ во всех своих деяниях. The I explicitly communicates that acknowledging the imminence of death has prompted her to dig deep into her soul and gain newfound self-consciousness. The I is most terrified of the moment of passing, of that during death, that is marked by suffering and the angst of not knowing what awaits her when she will die. When everything seems to have turned into darkness, the voice reacts to this angst by praying, «Принят мой с миром дух Творца, и взор на слабое создание обратить». So after experiencing the darkness of the night, the person expresses the Christian eschatological view. «О смерть, небесный дар, спокойствие начало, ты благодетель всех, кто остро твое надлежало». The voice conveys here the bittersweet taste of death, which is simultaneously a sharp sting and God's gift. The lyric persona understands that anyone would tremble if they saw death approaching. At the same time, she knows that incomprehensible is the force of nature which attracts us to life, so much so that even he who spent his entire life only in sorrow will, however, wish for his life to continue. And this is what she writes in the poem. So this way of looking at life and expressing her deepest thoughts ran contrary to the commonplaces of the time about death as a blessed release from earth. It is also a difference with much early Slavic poetry in which God is mostly represented as a severe judge, right? And the voice herself affirms, «Творце моем отца кратчайше прославляла». So here the I, on the one hand, gives the lie to the sentimental pictures of the virtuous woman who meets death with serene acceptance. On the other hand, instead, she develops this personal relationship with God that is rooted in the honest affection that characterizes both the familial and friendly relations that are typical of sentimental sensibility, and also the faith in God's goodness that is typical of Eastern Orthodoxy. So in Deathbed, Moskvina shapes a lyric I who faces death with a new attitude. The lyric voice vehemently emerges as a personal I as she discloses an unexplored world to the reader, a world in which opposites coexist, such as wait for death, but also fear of death, right? And also in which physical sensations, emotions, and reflections are interwoven. The personal lyric I reinterprets themes and motives that are typical of Orthodox spirituality in original ways. And she finds herself in this ultimate private space, which is the bedroom, right? And the bedroom in the poem goes from being this image of relaxing tranquility into a place of suffering. So she experiences a nighttime that neither represented that restorative light that we see in much classical poetry, nor the waking night of love and troubles, right? Instead, here the nighttime is the time when invalids grow worse, as Charles Baudelaire famously wrote, and that we will find in much 19th century poetry. Moskvina's personal I is not characterized by the inflexible heroism of classical time, but instead by fluid, profound passions. And so, moving now towards Anna Bunina's poem, May Walk widens the variety of themes that lyrics can feature. Maria Nesterenko specifies that illness was used as a metaphor in love lyrics, and that Bunina was the first to feature a real illness as a biographical element in lyric selfhood. Elaine Scarry points out also the rarity with which physical pain is represented in literature due to the challenge of expressing physical pain verbally and also of communicating it to those who do not suffer from the same condition. Instead, Bunina's poem is an attempt at sharing sorrow and also overcoming such difficulty. And while Moskvina wrote Deathbed as her pain and suffering were lessening, Bunina wrote May Walk while she experienced this intense physical pain and sorrow. So here too we will start from the title, which is built around an interesting oxymoron, right? Because the title first part, May Walk, describes a seemingly idyllic setting, right? We have an outdoor stroll in a pleasant weather as nature reawakens in the spring. Nevertheless, the second part of the title, of an ill woman, undermines these expectations, highlighting the protagonist's suffering and decay. So as Catriona Kelly writes, it is doubtful whether Anna Bunina's super poem, The Sick Woman's Maytime Stroll, written when the author was dying from cancer, would have been possible without the new tradition of introspection brought to Russia by the cult of sensibility. Indeed, the setting of the walk is a topos of sentimental literature that will also come to characterize the literature of the Romantic period. For instance, we know that walking played a crucial role in Karamzin works, in which walking or fermentation by foot, without plans, without goals, even leads the narrator to the surprising point in which the natural landscape connected with the historical in a friendly and organic way. And even Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was very popular among intellectuals at the time, contributed to the affirmation of this topos in the Russophone milieu, especially with his posthumous work, Les Rêveries. In it, Rousseau proposes Let me give myself up entirely to the sweetness of conversing with my soul, since that is the only thing man cannot take away from me. I will forget my misfortunes, my persecutors, my disgrace, while dreaming of the prize my heart deserved. In May Walk, Bunina adds something personal to this type of walk. In her poem, walking does not imply harmony with surroundings, nature, engaging in sweet conversations with oneself. Here, the eye does not aim to analyze her own life or forget unhappiness, which is what instead Rousseau proposes in Les Rêveries. The poem by Bunina, as well as that by Moskvina, goes beyond the image of femininity promoted by sentimentalism. As Schönle wrote, sentimentalist literature stays modest and tactful in its exposure of privacy, whereas May Walk Bunina shapes a personal eye that is never submissive and is novel for the Russian literary milieu and demonstrates that during that experience that is so rarely portrayed in literature. The suffering of the lyric eye is mirrored by the irregular structure of the poem, which comprises 10 stanzas of various lengths. As pain comes and goes and the sick woman's mind is engaging and disengaging with thoughts, this uncertainty is also reflected by the meter, the trochaic tetrameters, while the rhyme scheme is built on a concatenation of rhymes, imperfect rhymes, assonances that evoke the uncertain walk of an ill woman. The entire poem oscillates between the two extremes declared in the title. The lyric hopes to find solace in the intense colors and smells of the outdoors, which stimulate her senses. Мне л ти сонце улыбнулось, мне л сулишь отраду май. Травка, для меня ты стелишь, благовонный свой ковер. Может быть, мне там лучше. Побежим под сень древес. For a moment, the ill woman hopes that she may have found the relief she wished for in nature. But nature here is not that divine entity that we saw in Moskvina's deathbed, right? Here, nature is realistic. It comprises the sun, the grass, the trees, the springtime that the woman encounters during her walk. The person also betrays her uncertain hope through the phrase может быть and the ellipsis. Hope is also nurtured by her admiration for surrounding nature, whose beauty is a sign of divine goodness. Сколь все в мире великолепно, Боже, Боже, вездесуще, к смертным ты колико благ. But these feelings of admiration and harmony with her surrounding are, however, short-lived. The illness produces a suffering that annihilates the eye, her hopes, and also gets the better of the persona again, because it defines her being, her sensibility, and her circumstances, and even the way that she looks at her surroundings. Чётно веете, зефире, чётно соловей поешь, чётно запада золотого, солнце нищешь кроткий луч, и Петропол возлощая всю природу веселишь. So here, the voice is recalling the topoi of pastoral and romantic poetry, and is at the same time echoing them, but also upending them as they were presented, for instance, in the poems of other female authors like Volkova and Paspilova. In turn, the eye names the traditional elements of elegiac sentimental poetry, including, as we see here, the zephyr, the nightingale, the sun, only to negate them, however, through her personal experience. Indeed, here, the ill woman cannot enjoy any of this splendors. She says, «Солнце не ко мне сияет, я не дочь природы сей». So these lines hint at that romantic lyric eye that is defined through opposition and isolation from society. And here, the eye walking in a pained and combative way through the great big hell of a city, we may say, presents another typically romantic motif that we will see also in poems by Pushkin, Lermontov, later on, even like Blok or Mayakovsky. So here, the eye suggests that her sorrow is incommunicable, highlighting the dissonance between herself and nature, as well as her insurmountable insecurity and vulnerability. The lyric persona pays attention to her body's warning signs. When her body was healthy, it was silent and lived in harmony with its various components and her spirit. Now that she is healed, however, her once cohesive body demands all of her care and breaks down into separate parts, each signaling with its own affliction that her illness is progressing. So, каплі нет одной прохладной, тощи оросит уста. В огне дыхание притворилось, в острую стрелу каждый вздох. Все глубокие искрились язвы. So here the eye is defined by the unspeakable pain of her illness. Her body has changed, and the eye perceives the approaching of death. We see her fatigue, difficult breathing, the lack of full functionality. The eye conveys its deficiencies at the syntactic and semantic levels through a series of questions that we encounter in the third and fourth stanzas that express her physical and psychological dismay. Then we have anaphors and repetitions of where, где, a sequence of emphatic negation throughout the poem which exacerbate the eye's fixation on her illness. After the author compares her illness to a fire and the snake in the poem's opening, it rose in intensity. Но в груди огонь не гаснет, сердце тот же СМИ сосед. Тот же яд течет по жилам, ад мой там, где я ступлю. So these lines recall Scarry's analysis. She wrote, because the existing vocabulary for pain contains only a small handful of adjectives, one passes through direct descriptions very quickly and almost immediately encounters an as-if structure. It feels as if, it is as though. Consistent with this observation, the persona in May walk conveys their pain through metaphors. So we have breath, which burns like a fire, illness that steals life like a snake, and sorrow that circulates like a poison. So the eye employs anaphors in order to emphasize the severe rhythm of the trochee and concludes her reflection with a hyperbole that expresses the all-embracing nature of her sorrow. If hell is anywhere she steps, it is then everywhere. In this way, the eye fully erases any trace of hope. In this situation, physical pain is not an aspect of the eye, but her very essence. So whereas Moskvina's eye stated that even he who was unhappy on earth looked for help from his doctors, to the contrary, in Budina's poem, the eye affirms that no doctor can clean my wounds, no hands can dry my tears. There is also no space for comfort. Yes, here are the quotes. So there is also no space for comfort. Нету стен для утешения. So there are no lips to speak comfort, right? The persona can by no means relieve her pain and sorrow because pain and sorrow are part of her very being, right? She says, ад в душе моей гнездится, этно захшу грудь палец. She also localizes her illness in a precise body part, her breast, which is a clear symbol of femininity, but it is here transformed from a life nurturing organ into one that precipitates her into death. So the eye identifies the exact symptoms of her illness. Змей кровь, кипучую сосед, тщательно слабым перстами, рвут чудовище, нет сил. As Rosslin maintains, this is not the ethereal feminine posited by the Romantics. The eye in May Walk simultaneously affirms the romantic view of this relationship between the individual and society, but also overcomes it by showing how the cruelty of reality overpowers the idealization of imagination. Not even the idea of God can bring solace to the eye here. So God in May Walk is represented through antithetical qualities. In the opening stanza, the eye ascribes to God the qualities of goodness, truth, omnipotence, but also the responsibility for the suffering of his creation. So this is not that trustworthy God that we had encountered in Moskvina's lyric. Instead, here the sick woman is not presented as prefiguring in this life the world beyond, embodying the Christian virtue and mystical experience. She does not suppose the existence of a realm beyond the real world. So here the eye addresses a God that she cannot fully comprehend and with whom she needs to dialogue aloud in order to proclaim her suffering. Страждет рук твоих создания. Боже, кто коснешь? Воззри. Боже мира, запрети. Despite her faith in the existence of God, whom she consults through several lyric addresses, the eye struggles to understand how a God of goodness and truth, as she calls him, can generate suffering among his creatures. The eye sees God as responsible for her condition and questions him with a question that is actually reminiscent of certain episodes in the Bible, especially Job, where it says, "Your hands shaped me and made me. Will you now turn and destroy me?" So the eye is directing here a precise accusation at her creator. It's an utterance that acquires a metaphysical meaning. In May Walk, the eye also experiences the chronotop of the road, we may say, but in a particular way, right? So Bakhtin defined the chronotop of the road as a particularly good place for random encounter and adventure, but in Bunina's poem, the eye does not evoke the openness and availability that are required to make new encounters and meetings, right? The eye perceives herself as alienated. She says, "Все странятся, бегают, я одна." During her walk, the only other person she meets is an old beggar. She first sees him как тень из гробовства, an image that evokes not being, disorder, mystery, and sadness. This man is also close to death because as an old man is, to say, naturally prone to death, but also as a beggar, his survival is constantly in jeopardy. So the voice fears him. Oh, горе мне. The old man is a polysemous figure, we may say, because his white hair, sunken cheeks, blindness, and wrinkles indicate the passing of time, but his tears, trembling hand, and dry lips suggest illness, mirroring the condition of the lyric persona. Meanwhile, his words bring to mind the figure of the wise men, the So here, then, the woman actually reacts first with anger and dismissal, right? She starts by swearing at